Hello, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is the conclusion to our six-part series between Babel and Pentecost, a Christian analysis of multiculturalism. Links to the previous parts are in the description below, so please check those out first. But if you're all caught up, let's finish this thing off. And this time, we are going to be talking about the lessons learned, the implications of a Christian view of multiculturalism. At least these are the big lessons that I learned from pondering this, and I hope you will consider them as well. First lesson, diversity is not a strength. We're told exactly the opposite, at least I've been my entire life. Diversity is a strength. But it is not, at least it's not a strength in the granular sense that we're taught, i.e. that any nation's strength correlates positively with its internal diversity. Within a nation, it's precisely the opposite. God gave us different languages, and as a direct consequence of that, different cultures, specifically to curb sinful humanity, to make us weaker, to break us apart. That's what he did at Babel. Causing division is the specific reason that different languages even exist in the first place. Making us weaker was the whole point of diversity. High internal diversity within a nation, within a single jurisdiction, that means a much higher degree of competing interests in that same jurisdiction, along with a decreasing ability to work together cooperatively. It's much harder to govern effectively. There's much more social division. There's much less social trust. And when it reaches a certain point, it becomes almost impossible not to engage in identity politics. Because, well, what kind of nasty people don't look out for their own first when there's some kind of conflict between different groups? Well, yeah, white conservative Christians mainly. We're the worst at this. We love throwing each other under the bus for whatever reason. Look at Covington. How all sorts of conservatives jumped on those kids for one frame of a video in which they smirked. It's really shameful the way that we treat one another. And it's not hard to observe this dynamic of diversity dividing and weakening in America today. Mass migration has done what mass migration has always done in every place throughout history. And it has put the different interests of native versus migrant, or of one group of migrants and another group of migrants, all at odds with one another. Our exponentially growing list of identities has fractured us into this mess of special interests. And we have a harder and harder time agreeing on how we want to live together, how we want to be governed, how we want to be educated. Both the biblical and the empirical reality is that diversity divides rather than unites, precisely because we are less capable when a mishmash of different cultures and ideologies are all forced together into the same mold. But that brings us to lesson number 2. And that's that having a diversity of nations in the world, not under the same jurisdiction, that is a strength. That kind of diversity is actually a strength. What God did at Babel is not only a punishment, but also a gift of discipline. Distinction between the two being punishment is retribution. It's paying the price for a wrong that was done, whereas discipline is for altering behavior for the benefit of the person being disciplined. Now, for civil government in this world, Babel is a feature, not a bug. It's good that there are a lot of different nations. God blessed us by making it that way. There are a multitude of ways to restrain wickedness and form a civilization, but some ways work better than others. And some ways will work better in some circumstances than others. And some ways will work better for certain people groups than others. And having many different nations means that we have many different attempts at exploring these possibilities and creating different options for different people, all for that same purpose of civilization. And the thing is, any specific method of civilization that we develop, it's the work of generations. It's not the work of a few social programs or a few orientation classes. Rome wasn't built in a day. You can't simply take a people who have been trained in one way of civilization and then expect them to just immediately adopt a completely different one overnight without any kind of problems, without any kind of conflicts. Neither can you expect a mishmash of people trained in radically different ways of life to effectively live together and cooperatively maintain the same civil order, because they're going to have different ideas of what a civil order should look like. Now, there are certainly moral values and shared characteristics that are universal to humanity that transcend any kind of culture, but even these are very often expressed or pursued in different ways in different cultures. And some nations do so well. Some nations do so poorly. Most nations do some kind of mix of doing some things really well and other things really poorly. But having different ways of doing this, of civilizing, that is a blessing in a fallen world. And you have to contrast that with globalism, because globalism says that human beings are replaceable. They can get rid of all those distinctions, and that any people group can just be replaced with anybody else. And even though that it wears this happy face of peace and unity, globalism is a deeply anti-human ideology, and because it attempts to expunge all of those particulars: heritage, culture, identity, religion, family, all these things that not only make us who we are and give us those distinct identities, but also make up the substance of civilization. That's where we are civilized. It's how we are civilized. And because a truly diverse assortment of people cannot effectively join together as one, globalism has no choice but to try to expunge those differences and to undo Babel. And again, the global unity movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, they could very well be considered a kind of neo-Babelism, where the organization of humanity around this new uniting idol. And, maybe in some cases it was a master race. In other cases, that idol was a worker's paradise. Today we see it as a celebration of diversity, but it could be anything. But you see this dynamic. You can see it work on a large scale in fascist and communist societies, but you can also see it on a small scale. Every time multiculturalists try to celebrate diversity by annihilating culture. Every when December runs around and people celebrate diversity by requiring that you have to have a non-specific winter-themed party and forbidding celebrating Christmas. Where it's not really diverse. It forces everybody into the same meaningless gray blob, and none of us really want to be in that. Lesson number 3. Nationalism is the golden mean between tribalism and globalism. If having different nations in the world is a good thing, then we should welcome the preservation of those differences. Nationalism's reputation, it's a tainted one, mainly due to the endless history of wars between nations throughout human existence. When different nations have conflicting interests, those conflicts will sometimes erupt into violence, and they will continue to do so into the last day. But, and that's the thing, the naive progressive is going to look at that, and they're going to say, wow, there's so much conflict between nations. But if you compare that to a nationless world, in which we don't have any more differences over which to fight, why on earth would anybody choose nations over the nationless? But here's the problem. Wisdom does not compare the gritty reality of history with some ephemeral utopia that somebody just dreamed up. Wisdom compares one gritty reality with another gritty reality. And when it comes to violence and human misery, wars between nations pale in comparison to what utopians have done to their own people in the past century or so for the sake of unity. Progressive unity movements ruthlessly slaughter tens of millions of people for the sake of annihilating human distinctions like race or class or culture that prevented the kind of human cooperation that they dreamed of. And at least when you have two nations fighting, some authority is looking out for the best interests of each group to some extent. Nations are imperfect, but they're never going to do that very well. But at least you have somebody who is looking out for each group of people involved in a war, a conflict between nations. But when you're trying to force everybody into the same mold, there is no human authority looking out for the people who don't fit in. those people are left to the mercy of the utopians, and we have seen what they do. We have seen the results of that. And don't get me wrong, nationalism is by no means perfect, but it is this balance between tribalism, where there is no ability for different groups of people to cooperate, and globalism, which tries to force everybody into the same ideology. Nationalism allows for the unity of some portion of compatible tribes to work together within a nation for the sake of civilization and build a history and a heritage together, without demanding the conquest or the inclusion of incompatible tribes. And if you want to upgrade to the concept of nationalism, I really like Vox Dei's term omni-nationalism. The big weakness of nationalism is a tendency where putting your own nation first, which you should do, where that transforms into believing that your own nation is the only important nation, and that every other nation is expendable for your own sake. And that's the kind of perversion of nationalism that transformed it into imperialism. And that's not a good thing. Imperialism is not something that we want. Omni-nationalism adds the concept that other people groups have a right to govern themselves, just as you have a right to govern yourself. You put your own nation first, and every other nation is going to be putting their own nation first, but you don't try to make the other nation serve you. Okay, you respect their right to put their own nation first as well. And generally, when people are doing that, you're going to be minding your own business. And you're not going to interfere with them unless you're forced into interfering with them. Because you don't want them interfering with you either. And it's not perfect. I mean, this is not the sort of thing that's going to lead to world peace. But in a fallen world where nation will rise against nation until the last day, I have not come across anything better. Last lesson. Pentecost is for the church, not for the world. Babel is for the world, but not for the church. The church is multicultural, and needs to continue to be multicultural because we have a message of hope and forgiveness for the entire world. But the church has no mandate for making the nations multicultural as well. The church is eternal. The church is universal. The nations, limited in scope, temporary. They pass away all the time. Well, at Pentecost, God undoes Babel in Christ, and Christians of all tribes and nations are one in Christ. That doesn't speak about those who are not in Christ. Neither does it speak about the civil vocations of Christians. Just like how Paul says that in Christ there is no male and female, but the same Paul also teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that in the family, men and women have different roles. In Christ is not the same thing as in marriage. Likewise, in Christ is not the same thing as in the left-hand kingdom, in the civil realm, in the nation. The church transcends the nations, but it does not replace them. God's commands to the church and to Christian individuals, and God's commands to the nations are not the same commands. And we have to keep those straight. And in light of that, let's finish this off by bringing you back to the question I posed way back in part 1. You're the leader of a great nation, and you have a massive group of refugees on your border. 200,000 fighting men, along with additional women, children, old men, and so forth. Probably about 1 million people altogether. And they are fleeing from a foe that they cannot fight. And they are pleading to you to let you in. They will pledge their undying loyalty to you if you give them safe haven within your borders. So do you let them in? Do you have mercy on this fairly different culture that wants to join yours in the same jurisdiction? Well, the situation that I described back then, it was a real situation, as you probably guessed, and it was faced by the Roman Emperor Valens in the late 4th century. The Visigoths were fleeing the Huns, and they sought refuge within the Eastern Roman Empire. Western. But Valens decided to have mercy, and he decided to let all of those refugees in. He let them cross the Danube, come into Rome. And Valens was not oblivious to the risk of allowing so many armed barbarians into his nation. So as a part of the deal, what he ended up doing was that the Visigoths agreed to disarm themselves before crossing over the border. So you have 200,000 fighting men, but they're putting down their weapons and then coming into the territory for safe haven. But those things do not always go according to plan. Because despite the deal, the Visigoths, they really did not want to give up their weapons. And you can't really blame them for that. They're fleeing from a horrible foe. They're looking for safety, and well, that's one of the reasons people carry weapons, is to try to defend themselves. So they didn't really want to give up their weapons, and there were plenty of corrupt Roman officials who were quite willing to be bribed and to let the Visigoths remain armed. And of course, well, refugees don't exactly have a whole lot of personal wealth with them with which to bribe people in the first place. And they were made all the poorer by the kind of exploitation that they were seeing, and didn't get along particularly well with the Roman natives. And wasn't very long before they became desperate and resentful of the same Romans who gave them sanctuary. And within only 3 years, the Visigoths were not only raiding and pillaging Roman towns and villages, but they had killed Valens in battle, along with 2/3 of his army. And in less than 40 years, they sacked Rome itself, this landmark event in the eventual crumbling of the Western Empire. Because you see, the choice, it was never between showing mercy and not showing mercy. The choice was between showing mercy to your own people by protecting them from the barbarians, or showing mercy to the barbarians by sacrificing your own people to them. Valens chose poorly, because God had given him, as emperor, a responsibility to his own people. And all of us, as voters, as judges or politicians, or whatever roles we occupy in the civil realm, we need to remember that same responsibility to the nation that God has entrusted to us. And that's where we're going to leave this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sticking with this material for so long. And if you got something out of this series, then please like, comment, share the videos so that others can get something out of it as well. And as always, please subscribe to the channel, because we are going to have more material like this coming down the road. Because the devil never sleeps, and so the Reformation never ends.